Hey everybody, welcome back to Old World Legends, where we focus on growing the community. I'm your host Mike, and with me as always is Evan.
Yep, and I'm moving today. I'm moving from one place to another in a phase.
Oh, oh my goodness. All right, so kind of spoiling a little bit of what we're getting ahead there. So we've talked about before in some of our beginning guides in terms of the strategy phase, and we're going to continue that series today, going over to the movement phase and walking you through the steps of that and hopefully giving you some tips and tricks and a better understanding of how to move your units across the battlefield. So
Yep.
Evan, let's dive in.
Well, just to be clear, it's not just about moving from place to place. It's also about charging people and fleeing and running away and all of your random movement, moving onto the table from ambushing. So the movement phase
Mhm.
isn't just moving. I think that might be oversimplifying, right? So just like the other phases that we've talked about thus far, essentially the movement phase is broken down into different sub sequences, which helps to explain the
Yep.
order of operations here so that you don't get too confused. Now, the order of operations again will matter a lot because like whether or not you can declare a charge will depend on whether you are on the table. So ambushers can't charge the turn they come on because they don't actually show up until the compulsory move subphase, which is after the declare charges, right? And so they don't have to write
Mhm.
into the rules, hey, ambushers aren't allowed to charge, blah, blah, blah. They don't need to do that because it's just already laid out with the order of operations again. So that might be
Well, I know
something
they
that,
say that you don't need to
yeah.
do that, but it's confusing. Let's be honest, right? If you're new to tabletop gaming,
Yeah.
or to maybe you're spending a lot of your time playing 40K or AOS, or maybe some of those other games, they've really streamlined the game. Those games and made those rule sets really accessible. So there's a whole bunch of, as Evan was explaining here, we talked about in the strategy phase, implied things you can or can't do that they're not going to specify for you, because otherwise this rule book would become four times as wide if they had to say all those caveats all the time. So again, pay attention, be careful about the sub phases here, because if you're trying to do something and you're already past the phase where you can do it, it means you can't go back and do that. So there's a lot of implied what you can or can't do relative to the order of operations of the sub phase. I know it sounds pretty simple and intuitive, but until you've got a lot of games under your belt, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to not notice these nuances, as Evan was saying. And the more games you get to play, the easier it becomes.
Okay, so the first thing to point out here is that you do all of your declaring of charges first, and you have to declare all of them in a row, and then your opponent gets to pick what they want to react to each of them individually. And one of the things about this is it's very different than the old Warhammer Fantasy rules. In the old Warhammer Fantasy rules, you would declare one charge, and then your opponent would have to respond to that one before finding out if you were going to charge with anybody else. And so one of the things that this does is it gives the unactive player, the other your opponent, more agency during your turn to be able to wait and see. Okay, if you charge me with multiple units, maybe in this scenario I would flee, or maybe because you're charging with multiple units, I'll hold because if I fled, I would get caught easily, right? And in old
Yeah.
Warhammer Fantasy Battle, you wouldn't be able to predict this.
And the reason why this is really cool is this is going to create for the attacker a more interesting risk to reward
Yeah,
strategy that would have been lost otherwise. Because if I'm just declaring one at a time and then I know what my opponent's going to do, I don't have to worry about the next decisions of all my other units, right? But if I have to declare them all at once, this is like, okay, I need to decide if my opponent does this or does that, what could potentially happen. So suddenly, right, I don't know what the results are going to be or what my opponent's going to do. So there's risk to reward. Do I undercommit? Do I overcommit? What do I think the opponent's going to do? And then it's really fun on the other side. You get a lot more agency too. Like, okay, here's all the things coming in. Can I change the order in which I'm responding to these things, because I get to decide what my units are going to do to help to mess up my opponent or to put myself in a better position. So this is actually, it seems like such a small tweak, but it's such a fun added depth that really makes this phase a lot more interesting for both players.
right. And the other thing that this does is it also removes the old double flee situation where if you had a unit of like pistoliers, they got charged by somebody, you could flee the first one, and then if another unit charged them, they would just get to flee a second time and then allow them to just zip all over the table,
Which
just
is
totally
weird.
dodging out of the way of people. Where now, if you have like a dwarf warriors in the front who are pretty slow, but you have a gyrocopter behind them, and you charge from the front and the back, now if they flee, they'll just get caught almost automatically.
Yep, getting caught is really bad. You're going to get wiped out. So I think that's a pretty good
Yeah.
difference too. And again, a small nuance there is that the fleeing happens in this part of the phase. So there are other things. We're not going to go back through the strategy phase again right now, but there are other things that you would do during the strategy phase, such as a rally test if your
Yeah.
unit happened to be fleeing. They don't move in the strategy phase. They would make that flee move in the movement phase. And that nuance there, the book kind of glosses over it. But this comes back towards what Evan was saying, that in the new edition of the game, the current edition of Old Worlds, a unit can only flee once in a given phase. So if it had fled in the strategy phase, well, it could now flee again from a charge of the movement phase. But what I just said is not possible, because if you're fleeing from a failed rally test, you
Yeah.
don't move in that strategy phase. You move in the movement phase. So suddenly, my unit that was fleeing, I failed my rally test. I flee here, and now Evan charges me and catches me. I can't flee again because I've already fled this phase. So again, it really feels a lot more grounded. It feels better that the units are only moving a distance that feels appropriate for them to move. And you can catch units a lot easier if you plan things in advance and you position units correctly, which is really fun.
Right, and if you play the way I do, sometimes you want your units to get caught on purpose. Because what happens when a charging unit catches a fleeing unit? They
You
just
stop.
stop moving and sit there. If a charging unit
Mm-hmm.
catches a unit and gets to fight them in combat, they can then overrun, which means they could move their charge range plus 2d6 on their overrun, right? But if they
Mm-hmm.
just charge a unit of Empire archers, for example, and they flee and then get run down, you will only get to go as far as those archers got to, which might leave you sitting right in front of my unit of greatswords, who are very excited
Yeah.
to charge you now.
And that's a big difference between older editions versus this edition. Before, it would be, if I'm charging something, you're just going to keep going, going, going your full distance. Even if you killed something, you'd shoot past it. In this edition, you stop as soon as you catch whatever the victim is, and wherever they were positioned is where you catch them. You stop right there. So because you stop there, again, that's creating more agency to the other player, that they can start deciding, maybe I do want this unit to get caught. Maybe I actually want this to be positioned here. Sure, you're going to kill me, but you're going to kill me anyway. And now I know where your unit's going to be, and you can set up his counter charges, which is really fun.
Okay, so after we do all our declare charges and charge reactions from the opponent, the active player gets to make their charge move. So this is where you roll to see how far you're going to make your charge. You get the Swift Ride get to add their d6 bonus, and then you get to pick the order. Now sometimes when you're charging with, like the other day, I was charging with some unit of Dragon Princes who were off to one side, and they were in drilled, kind of a marching column formation. And I was also charging in the front with a unit of spearmen and a chariot. So the order that I was going to do this in was going to be pretty important to make sure that they all actually get to make it. Because if you do it wrong, you could actually send the spearmen in first, they fail their charge, and now the chariot can't get around them because they're stuck in their way, right? So as the active player, you get to pick the order that they go in. And just like I said about having drilled, I could then see where my other units got to before picking the Dragon Princes to move, and then I could use their drilled maneuver to get as many models in the front as I could to still make it to the enemy after seeing how much space I had.
So that's an important distinction there, that basically just because your unit can declare a charge and does roll the distance does not guarantee that it's going to get into combat, right? There are things that can get in the way. So this is where the game will allow you to make mistakes. You need to plan what's going to happen and make sure you're giving your army, your troops, the right orders, and then you choose the order in which you resolve them. And if you choose the wrong order, if you're maybe not as experienced of a general and perhaps get a little too excited with the wrong units, you could find you unintentionally blocking your other units from getting into combat or getting into position where you want them to be. So again, this is a deep rule set. It's a really fun rule set, but it's also a rule set that will allow you to make mistakes, right? So be careful and pay attention to the order in which you do that.
And notice here also that we're doing charges instead of movement. So unlike in 40k, where sometimes a unit can move and then advance and then also charge, it just does all of those in one turn. Oh, and you got to shoot in there somewhere too. In basically the old world, we're doing charges first, and if you charge, whether you make it or not, you're not going to shoot or do any other movement for the rest of the turn. That was it. You did your thing. So if you charge and you fail, that's the whole thing that unit did that turn, pretty much.
Yeah.
Okay, so then after we do all of the charge stuff, then we do the rest of the moves. So the compulsory moves is the first one up. This is where units that are fleeing are going to move. Units that have random movement will move, and then any ambushers will show up, and a few other things of that nature will basically happen here. Now, one thing to note here is that you can see charges had to happen before compulsory moves and before remaining moves, which means that if you have a unit that has like a screen of some archers in front of it, that unit can't make the charge because the other archers can't move out of the way first. It has to be a whole other turn, or they have to flee, for example, during someone else's turn. So if you put a unit of like Illyrian Reavers or something in front of your unit of Dragon Princes, unless if the Illyrian Reavers also make a charge, the Dragon Princes won't be able to charge because they're basically blocked off. Now, sometimes you do that on purpose because your unit is impetuous or something, but
Yep.
sometimes this will really screw people up and they will be like, no, I'll just move them out of the way and then I'll charge you. And no, you can't do that because of the order of operations again.
Yeah, so you really got to be planning this in advance.
Mm-hmm.
In the previous turn, again, there is a lot of that chess level of depth and strategy where you're trying to plan 1 or 2 turns in advance of what you think where units are going to be and how things are going to be play out, so that you're in the right position and you're not blocking yourself, or the enemy is not putting in a position where they're going to block you, and it's a lot of fun.
So just remember as well, also, that sometimes the best way to learn is to make the mistake and then be like, oh, that was a mistake. That's how I learn. I just try to play a lot of games and just, oh, wow. I think it was on Saturday, I was playing against Eric. He was running dwarfs for like the second time ever. And
Hmm.
I charged a lion chariot, a unit of elf spearmen, and the dragon princes into his unit of longbeards, completely forgetting that they had the banner of hesitation, so I didn't get my impact hits or my
Oh no!
so I had
Oh no!
I had 7 dragon princes crash into the front of a unit of dwarf longbeards with no lances. They were strength 3
Oh!
because I just like forgot
Oh!
that he had that.
Oh, brutal. Yeah, dwarves are tricky. Dwarves are awesome. So yeah, you're gonna make mistakes. It's okay. Guess what? It's a fun game. Whether you're winning or losing, as long as you have a great opponent who's having fun with you, you're gonna have a great time. But you will make mistakes as you're learning how to play.
Okay, and finally we have remaining moves phase. So it's kind of funny they call it that. This is essentially the main movement phase. This is what people think of when they think of the movement phase. They think of, oh, I just march my guys around, they reform, they turn around, they do different dances, whatever. This is where we make units do all of the other moves that weren't fleeing or charging, right? This is also where you'll have some special abilities, like for example, characters join units during the remaining moves phase, and
Mhm.
other things will activate. So don't be fooled by the name remaining moves as if it's just some afterthought. It's actually pretty important.
Yeah, it was interesting that they called it that. I get the reasons why they called it that. I think it would have been easier for players to understand if it had been called like standard movement, right? Or default movement or something else to convey this is the basic, I'm just moving a unit or marching a unit. I'm not charging something or I'm not forced to do something. But that's the wording they went with. But the interesting part is it's at the end, right? You have to do the charging stuff first, the charge reactions first, the charge moves first, then the compulsory movement. And once that's all done, then you do the basic movement for your units. So you have to plan things in advance to make sure you're positioning them in the right place.
All right, let's go through some other basically breakdowns of this. So first of all, there's the 1 inch rule. So unless if you're charging an enemy unit, you can't end up within 1 inch of them. So if you like make like a
Yep.
failed charge or something like that, just make sure that you keep a 1 inch gap. And it says here to just nudge the units by the smallest amount possible to keep an inch gap. Now, one of the main reasons for this is to prevent people from forgetting who's in combat with whom, right?
Yep.
But unlike previous editions of Fantasy, you do not have a 1 inch rule for your own units, so you can put your friendly units right up next to each other. And there are a lot of
You can.
advantages to doing that now.
And also disadvantages depending on suddenly you can't wheel or move the way you want to. So it just depends on the situation. And the 1 inch rule, again, I think the big thing pointing out there is it talks about nudge them the smallest distance possible to get the rule as close as possible. So the one thing to keep in mind about old rule, this is a very deep rule set and it's a very fun movement system, which again, it makes the units feel like units, like infantry marching across the battlefield, and they're not always the most graceful thing, which also means it's not a perfect system. You are going to get into situations where this is weird or there's a building here or whatever there, and it's not going to be perfect. And you're going to see multiple instances of the rule set where it says, hey, this is the general rule. You and your opponent do everything you can to follow this rule. And if for some reason there's a problem, move it the smallest distance possible or do the smallest adjustment possible to get it as close to the rule as you can. So this is one of those examples of that. There will be others in the future. So keep in mind, it's not going to be perfect, and you're going to get some units and some weird positioning, and you're going to have to figure it out with your opponent.
Okay, so as we continue on, so it's just breaking down here like this is the charging. Now, something that's really interesting. Who can charge? So here's a really common one. If you're in marching column, you can't declare a charge unless if you have drilled, for example, that allows you to spread out before you make your charge. Another one is if your unit rallied this turn, so if it had, let's say, fled the previous turn and had just rallied, that unit's not allowed to charge. It is allowed to march, which is very, very weird and leads to some hilarity on the table when you're like, oh, I ran away from you? I'm going to reform into a marching column when I rally, and then I'm going to sprint that way. See you later, right? It's classic.
Strategic redeployment.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the area here about who could charge that get people off guard, newer players more often than not, as Evan said, is in this edition in particular, they wanted to make fleeing or in rallying from a flee not as punishing as it was in previous editions. So if a unit does rally, it can still move, it can still march, it can still shoot, it can still cast spells. The biggest penalty if you were fleeing and then rally is you can't declare a charge. That's the biggest penalty in this edition, which is a lot less of a penalty than other editions where you couldn't do a lot of other stuff. So that's a big thing here too. And also, again, the impossible charge. This is typically where a lot of people get confused on how that works pretty often. Evan, you want to walk us through an impossible charge? And it basically, you cannot declare it if it's impossible. So what does it mean if it's an impossible
So
charge?
first of all, it would be if you're just simply too far away. Now, one of the problems with this is because you have to measure your wheel during a charge, it can be a little bit difficult to figure out if it's impossible before you started doing it. And you're like, oh wait, I don't think even if I rolled a 6, I could get there, right? So just imagine if in your mind, what would happen if I took my movement value and I took this, a 6 on the dice? Would I actually make it? And if you can't, then you can't even declare it in the first place. Which is important to know when you have units that have frenzy or impetuous and they have to test if they can charge, right? And then
and that's
another one is if there's
the wheel is you have to calculate in the wheel as part of the charge. Now you
right.
have to just wheel enough to make the charge, and this is where I think a lot of people also get confused. It's if I declared a charge versus Evan's unit and I went directly forward with my unit, if I'm not going to make contact with him, that's not valid. I have to. What's the minimum wheel distance my unit has to make so that if I went directly forward, I would make contact with them. That then you measure that wheel distance, and then going forward, how much further you have to make. That is your distance you have to go, and if that's outside of your movement distance plus d6, so you could calculate Swiss right if you have Swiss right in, then you can't declare the charge. Now that's different from you must maximize your charge, and that's saying, hey, actually, if I rolled a 6 on my charge and I have a movement of 8 or whatever, if I had 5 extra inches to get to Evan's unit, it's saying you must keep wheeling or do everything you can to get as many of your models into contact with your opponent. That is different from the minimum required to actually make contact with a charge. So don't get those two concepts confused.
Right. And then another one here is that's really common is that it'll be impossible to charge if your units are basically blocking your unit to block up. So like I was saying earlier, if I have my Illyrian Reavers in front of my Dragon Princes, even though those guys are drilled, if the Illyrian Reavers are in front of the middle of the Dragon Princes, it doesn't matter how much I extend the accordion, I won't be able to get past them, right? Or another really common one is that a dragon can't charge a unit if there's no room for it to land. So what's really often happens is we'll have, like, let's say goblins will be sitting in front, right? And you'll have a wizard hanging out right behind the goblins, but like flush with them. And so the dragon wants to charge the wizard, but he can't because there's no room for him to land and then go directly into contact with that guy. So because of that, can't do it, right? You'll have to charge the thing in front. And oftentimes those goblins are too busy fighting your spearmen or something, and now there's no room for you to land either. So when you have units that fly, you might think, oh, I can go anywhere, but maybe not.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, charging more than one unit. So you're not allowed to do this unless if you have to. So unlike in 40k, you can't just declare charges on everyone nearby and then just show up and see what happens. The only way you charge multiple units is essentially that you're gonna contact somebody else too when you make it. Now the really common situation here is you're playing against someone, you have a wide line of, let's say, white lions, right? I'm really on a high elf kick today. And they want to charge in onto a chaos spawn, a gigantic chaos spawn, but that chaos spawn is sitting next to another chaos spawn, and they're right next to each other. So there's no way for you to hit the one chaos spawn without also hitting the other one because you're a big, wide infantry brick. So now you have to declare on both of them and they'll both hold because they're immune to psychology. But
Yeah, and that goes back to the situation everyone was describing earlier. Maybe you do want your units flush with each other, friendly units. So specifically, you're doing that to put the opponent in a position where, cool, you want to charge this one, you got to charge its buddy next to him because you're not going to be able to make contact without making contact with the other things. So there are definitely reasons why you would want to do that.
okay, so we're gonna go over charge reactions here. This is one of the most interesting parts of the game. Now, a lot of people are not familiar with what you might play here, even if you're coming over from 40k or if you have played other games before, because you have just a free reign to pick what you want to do when someone charges you between some really interesting options. The kind of default thing to do is to hold. Now, that means your unit will stand there and not run away. As long as they don't have a terror, for example, you don't have to take your terror check. They're just going to sit there, and you'll see if they make it. Now, you might want to do this if the enemy is charging pretty far. And what if they just fail their charge and now you get to charge? Because they just got nice and close to you, right? It's great.
Mm-hmm.
If you have missile weapons, you can stand and shoot. So if you are a unit of like Thunderers or something, you're like, great, you want to charge me? This is awesome. I get to shoot you again. So you might end up shooting in your turn and in their turn. Why not? You do have a -1 to hit on that. And then also you do get to roll this right now, for example, and any damage you do does go into the combat if the combat is joined, which is great. And it points out here that you don't have to take panic checks if they take some damage from the shooting, for example.
Yeah.
Because the reason for that is because if you do 3 wounds of damage to a 10 wound unit, for example, on the way in, well, great, that's your combat resolution. So it'll go into their break check. They don't need to also take a panic check. That would just be crazy. We don't need to do that.
Yeah.
And finally,
super not fun to charge something. You get a few of your models chopped off, and then panic before you ever got into combat. So they're like, no, you're charging that unit. As long as they roll the distance, they are going in, no matter how many of the guys get shot on the way in.
okay, and finally, perhaps the best option a lot of the time, which newer players will not know to do, is fleeing. Because one of the things that's really strong in this game is to have Swift Stride and have a real long charge range. But guess what? If you're 19 inches away from me and you're going to use your Fly 10 and Swift Stride to try to get me, I can just flee and you will not get me. Right? Mm-hmm. So as long as I have enough room, I'll just run away. And then where are you? You're just sitting there somewhere there you don't want to be, not in combat with me. So that's great, right? So fleeing...
Yeah, that's a big thing.
Yeah, we probably just need an entire video to go over when you want to flee, but I laid out one scenario there. So if people are charging you from like their max charge range, you can definitely just flee from that. If you have a pretty high leadership unit, you can flee from stuff. If you have a unit that mostly does shooting, you can probably just flee from things because you can just rally and then shoot them again. It's mostly just when you have a brick of like melee dudes where you're like, well, if I flee, I don't get to charge next turn. So that's like basically 2 turns where I'm out not doing anything, right? So maybe that's not always what you want to do with them.
Or maybe you're near the table edge, and if you flee, you might go off the table edge,
that
which
never
would be
happens.
really bad.
This never happens to anybody.
And then, but I think the 2 biggest things with flee, to Evan's point, is new players is it's the same thing that happens to pretty much all new players. You get the bloodlust of, yeah, let's go in, let's charge, let's make this happen. And you forget that you have other options. And sometimes a tactical retreat is the best option because, again, you could get the enemy out of position and such. So fleeing is one of the most powerful tools. And the other big thing, again, for new players is there are some things that can't flee, things in particular that are immune to psychology. There are a lot of things that are immune to psychology, such as the undead. And the undead, if you're immune to psychology, you cannot flee. That is one of the biggest, if not the biggest disadvantage to being immune to psychology is the enemy knows if they charge you, you are staying put. So keep that in mind for all the people who are like, wow, immune to psychology is the best rule ever. It has a pretty big downside to it.
Yeah, ask my sisters Valorn about that. So just a couple more. The main rulebook doesn't talk about this yet, but there's a really common also reactions here. So there's fire and flee, which combines stand and shoot and flee, which is great. And there's also counter charge, which is where you get charged. Well, guess what? I'm going to charge you right back. And so sure, we'll talk about that in the special rules section, but just to point it out, in some cases there's like 5 options. If you're somehow a unit of pistoliers, you can either hold, flee, stand and shoot, counter charge, or fire and flee. You have all of those options.
Whew, that's a lot.
And anyway, so we have multiple units. So if you are charged by multiple units, you can only stand and shoot against one of them. You don't just get to shoot all of them. If you flee, you don't get to pick who you flee against. So you flee away from the unit with the highest unit strength. So like I said earlier, if you get charged by dwarf warriors in the front and you charge by a gyrocopter from behind, well, you're going to flee from the warriors towards the gyrocopter, and now the gyrocopter has swift stride. It's just going to catch you and you're dead. So
Hmm.
that's one way that dwarves essentially catch people and force them to actually fight them and not just run away all day.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing is, as we said before, with the charge reactions, is effectively the attacker is declaring, all right, here's all the things that I'm going to charge. I make all my declarations in terms of as the aggressor, and then Eben, you as the other player make your charge reactions. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so charge moves. When it's really simple like this, you just go straight ahead, of course. You have to maximize contact. So something about this is that if, you have orcs charging into crossmen here. So you have to try to get as many of your models touching all of their models if you have enough movement to get there. Now, oftentimes
Hmm.
when a unit will charge something that's kind of kitty corner to it, they won't make it all the way and they'll be able to just kind of clip corner to corner. And that's just because they didn't have enough movement to get more guys in contact.
Hmm. Yep.
Okay, so compulsory moves. So we talked about this earlier. So fleeing units, in general, a unit will just move 2d6 inches. If they're a random mover or if they have swift stride, they can go up to 3d6. Now, one of the rules that bothers me the most is that if you have fleeing cavalry, they can just pick whether or not they want to use their extra speed, which bothers me to no end. But that's a thing you're allowed to
But
do.
that's the rule.
Is it though?
Yes.
Well, I think this rulebook and many of the other rules, they say you may do something a lot, and then they FAQ later, no, you have to. Like, for example, you may use one of your attacks as a bite attack with your Chaos Dragon, right? But then they FAQ later, no, it has to be one and can only be one. Because there are people who are trying to use all of the Necrosphinx's attacks with the tail, right? And
Yep.
people are trying to use none. They didn't want to use the bite at all. They wanted to just use
That
the
was a good
claws.
FAQ. I think the main thing right there in terms of units with swift stride is that the way it was written in the raw rules, it's worth mentioning here. It says, right, the unit may, and it wasn't clear whether they had to declare the intent or not declare the intent before rolling the dice. Because we've given you several examples, even in this video, of hey, I declare all my charges all at once, and then the opponent is going to then declare his charge reactions, right? So there's that risk versus reward, and you're going to see this theme consistently throughout the rule set, not everywhere, but fairly consistently, where they want a decision point to have a risk versus reward strategy associated with it. And so before, when it was you may use it, it wasn't clear. Well, I could roll my dice first and then decide to use it. Well, now there's no risk versus the reward because you already know the result of your dice. Versus they did, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, added to the FAQ where they said you do need to declare before you roll the dice. Yes?
Yes, that was in the latest FAQ. So at the very least, you didn't have the scenario of I'm always going to roll my 2 dice, see what numbers I get, and go, oh, I want to go a little further. Let me add my d6 after seeing how far that was going to be. In fact, I just recently had a unit of Illyrian Reavers fleeing from a charge from Iron Drakes, and I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to roll 2 dice. And then I only went 4 inches, and I was like, uh-oh. Even though these guys are Iron Drakes, they might catch my fast cav because I only went
You
4
roll
inches.
that. Yeah, you roll that back, and that's the point of the risk versus reward. Is you now with the FAQ, if you have Swiss Stride, before you roll the dice,
Yeah.
for any of the situations, you have to declare: Am I using my Swiss Stride bonus die, or am I not? And that's again part of that risk versus reward situation, which just makes the game more fun. That you are put into those difficult situations, right? Interesting decision points is what makes the game fun, and that is an interesting decision point.
Okay, so we also have compulsory movement. So this is usually just like I said, amateur showing up and random movement. Basically, nothing is here unless if there's a special rule. That's it, right? Okay, and then remaining moves. So this is basically where all the other movement happens, including all of your conveyance spells. So one of the things we didn't point out earlier is that all of those spells that are used for movement, none of them are allowed to help you charge further.
Yep.
Which is kind of
Common thing is everyone asks, I have arcane urgency. I get to move again with a random move or something else. Does it let me charge? No. Doesn't let
yeah,
me charge. Because it
let you
doesn't
charge.
happen when the charging, the subphase was occurring. You are casting it after all the subcharging phases are occurring. So that's one of those examples where the rule doesn't specifically say it in the spell, but because the order of the turn, it's the implied no, it will not let you do that.
Yeah, I think the big bummer for me is that I can't use Steed of Shadows to make Chaos Warriors be able to charge far enough to do stuff, right? But that's what the rules writers did not want you to be able to do that.
Yep.
So now we have movement and detail, right? I mean, This is basically for all like the kind of regular movement, and this is kind of to break down how the movement happens. Like for example, for charges, like if it's going to tell you about wheels and pivots and things, these are going to be coming up specific for it later. So marching is when you're allowed to just double your movement value. You could see one of the things about Old World and Warhammer Fantasy in days gone past is that the stats for movement inches is a lot lower than a lot of other games. Because you get to march, and this allows you to just double that stat. So if you have movement 4, movement 5 infantry guys, they get to then double that and go 8 or 10 inches, for example. You do have to take a march test if you want to start marching when a unit's within 8 inches. Now this is funny, so you can actually send up little fast units that have to force the enemy to try to take march tests, and sometimes if they have low leadership, they might fail this and then not be able to get close to you or get to where they want to be, or often not be able to get out of your charge arc. That's a very common one. People will very often be like, "How can I march to just get behind you so you can't charge me anymore?" That sounds like a great option. Let me do that. Okay, maneuvers. So because we have these square units that aren't on round bases but are instead on these big kind of bricks that we're talking about, we don't just move wherever we want. Unless you're a skirmisher.
Yeah, that's different.
Right. But instead we have 6 different kinds of... There's 6 of them? Really? Wow. 6 maneuvers.
Yeah, there's quite a few.
So the main one is wheeling, which is also the one that's the hardest to measure how far you went, just so you know. But wheeling is where you can imagine that you put a finger down on one front corner of your unit and then push on the back of the unit from the opposing corner so that it pivots, but not around the center, but around the corner of it itself. And this then will swing it around like a door opening in a doorway. And then you have to measure how far did the furthest guy on the farthest corner go, and that's the wheel distance. So if we're going to wheel, like for example, these 15 degrees they went here, you have to figure out how far did this model on the upper right go in figure 124, right? And
so I think one thing to point out with all these maneuvers before we get too far ahead is there's 6 of them. A unit can only perform one maneuver during its remaining phases, right? So you can't wheel and reform and march and do all those things. You get to do one of these types of maneuvers, and the only exception is the wheel during your turn. If you are wheeling, you may wheel more than once during your movement, but with these
you
other
can wheel
movement
more
things,
than once, and you can wheel during a charge, for example, and you can wheel during a march.
Yep.
That one maybe throws people off a little bit at first. It's like, oh, you can march and wheel. Yes, you can march and wheel, but you can't do a redress the ranks and march. You can't do a turn maneuver and march. And these ones are, I would say, on the order of expert level maneuvers because they are very rarely used. Because a lot of the time, if you wanted to change where your guys are facing, you could just do a reform instead, which is where you get to just do a free orientation. The only time you want to do like a turn maneuver, for example, is if you want to also get to move an inch or two after you do it. Because usually what happens is these orcs are movement 4. We do a turn maneuver so that they all change their facing to face to the right now. And then we get to move half of what's left, right? Because a turn maneuver uses a quarter to movement, right?
Almost everybody gets turned wrong. In terms of the way because they just assume, oh, I just completely changed my unit to face 90 degrees in a different direction. Look at the picture. That's not at all what happens. It's literally the individual models are turning, and that will change potentially depending on the formation of your unit, change its frontage, which could cause problems. As an example, if you look at the very top figure there of the orcs, you see that they are in the normal frontage, right, and they're able to wheel, charge, etc. But if they turn, well, all of a sudden they're deeper than they are wide. So now they're in a marching column, right?
Yeah.
And so now you actually can't declare a charge on your next turn. So almost everybody gets turn confused with other things.
A turn is not a pivot.
The individual model's turn. Yeah, it is a different thing, which is, quite frankly, it almost never happens. There are some times where it does. It, as Evan said, it's an expert level thing, but it's pretty rare for it to occur, even for experts at the top tier tables. It's just very uncommon.
Each 90-degree turn is a quarter of your movement, and then so essentially if these orcs did a turn, they would then have 3 inches left to then just walk forward 3 inches.
Mm-hmm.
You can move backwards. Now this one is more common because what you'll often see is people will move into their enemy's charge range or into their own. Like let's say you're playing an all-infantry dwarf army against Bretonnia, and they move up so that they're exactly, 16 inches away from you, or 14 inches away, so they can still charge you with their knights. And you go, cool, I'm going to go backwards 1 inch, and now you can't charge me anymore, and I'm going to shoot you. Great.
Yep.
So moving backwards is important.
It's good.
You can also move sideways.
Hmm.
This one's probably a little bit more uncommon because the main reason you do this is because like you got your own unit in front of another unit and you're like stuck and you're like, okay, I got to move sideways so that I can get charge arcs and stuff open up,
Or it
right?
could be some terrain or something is just in the way. Yeah. But moving sideways and backwards will happen fairly often at some point throughout the battles.
So redress the ranks is a maneuver that's very rarely used unless if a unit has drilled, which allows them to kind of do this for free before
Yep.
any other maneuver. And what redress the ranks lets you do is either add up to 5 models to the front rank or remove up to 5 models from the front rank. So you can go from up to a unit that's 10 wide to a unit that's 5 wide, like in this first chart here, or from a unit
Hmm.
that's 5 wide to a unit that's 10 wide, like in this second chart. And this is what I was describing being able to do with my Dragon Princes earlier, where we have this unit that's kind of in a very narrow, long formation that because they have such long movement, you can then spread them out into a single line in a single go and then just charge right after, right? And so that's what a drilled unit gets to do.
Yeah. The
Um,
other instance besides using so drilled is the time where if your unit has drilled, which is one of the best rules in the game, you'll use this all the time because the unit is going to want to pop in and out of marching column to go triple its movement and then back out so it can charge
yeah,
out of marching column into standard formation. So you're going to see that all the time with drilled. The other time that you will see it, and you will still see it for units that don't have drilled, is just hey, I'm trying to block up space on the board, so I might have my 5-man frontage, and the opponent's coming by, and they're going to try and get by with one unit or another unit on either side, and I'm just going to want to okay, I just want to take up this space, expand my frontage, have your models go to the side, so your just physical frontage is wider to block more space, or the other way, shrink to let one of your units go by. So it's really about taking up space
right.
with the units that don't have
But
drilled,
just
taking up,
remember though,
shrinking, and expanding.
just remember you could always just do a reform instead. So
Hmm.
when you do a redress the ranks, it's limited to 5 models, and a reform is not. So
True.
a redress the ranks, and the only real reason to do a redress instead is so that you can go an inch and a half forwards afterwards. Like for example,
Yep.
if these dwarves have movement 3, they first do a redress which takes half their movement, so they go from 3 to 1.5, and then they have 1.5 left to just stumble forward slightly. Now sometimes that's really important, but other times you could just do your reform and then you get to do well. We'll show you later, right?
Yep.
Okay, so the final one is reform. Now notice pivoting is kind of like a maneuver, but you're not allowed to just do it normally. The only way to pivot normally is to do a reform, which allows you to first change your ranks. Unlike what we were saying with readjust ranks, you get to just have as many guys as can go within their double their movement value. So it's just how many guys can get there within my movement times 2 to get
Hmm.
in or out, right? And so it'll be, if you have a cavalry unit, it's just like all of them can go from a column to a single line because their movement's a lot, right? Um, and then a reform lets you do that first, and then afterwards you can pivot your whole unit around its center by up to 180 degrees as long as no single model went more than double of their movement value during the whole start to finish situation, right?
Yep. And this will happen a lot. Reform, in
Yeah.
particular, will happen a lot also after
Yes.
combat situations, when we cover that in future videos and such. So it's pretty often. And the main thing is that sometimes it's just easier and faster to just heck with it. I'm going to sacrifice no charge, no march. I just need to face a different direction or be positioned in different because somebody's coming around my flank or they've flown behind me, right? Can't just back up. They would still charge the rear of my unit. So you just got to nope, just everyone about face reform, face this other direction, deal with this threat that's over there. So it will happen actually a lot more often than you think throughout the course of a game.
Yeah, another thing that pivoting will come up with is that any unit that has lumbering, so heavy chariots and behemoths, can do a
Hmm.
free pivot after any move that isn't a march, so that they can then, like, for example, do a move 6 inches forward and then just do a free 90-degree pivot so that they face the flank of somebody or be able to breathe fire on somebody.
Yeah, helps them get into position.
So this is a pretty new rule here, the ends of the world. Now this one is to say that the end of the battlefield is not like a literal cliff, which means that you can have a unit right on the edge of the battlefield, right? And then be able to wheel so that some of the guys kind of go off the table temporarily before they then march back on. And that is allowed to
Hmm.
happen because we're not assuming that the edge of the battlefield is a literal cliff.
That being said, it is open to interpretation of the players because it says the corner of a unit. Well, what is the quarter of a unit? The quarter of the unit is what you and your opponent agree is the reasonable amount of a unit. My typical go-to when I'm teeing over events is 25%. is what I would consider the quarter of an individual model and or 25% of a unit. But again, you need to make judgment calls on that because 25% of a square versus 25% of a very long, line formation is going to be very different how much of something is or isn't going over the table edge. So it's great that they have this rule. But again, remember, this is a two-player game and you and your opponent need to be good sports and make sure that you are in alignment on what feels reasonable when you're playing the game.
My interpretation of this was always that what they mean to say is that the front of your model's bases can't go off the table, but that the backs of their bases could go off. So the front of the unit can be wheeling like this, while then some of the guys in the back get temporarily clipped out of frame. Like I'm partially out of frame, but I'm going to come back in once I'm done with my movement. Now, but you're totally right that this
Not what it says.
is ambiguous, and it's not.
Yep. So
And to be
you and your
clear, that
opponent,
isn't
make
really
sure
what it says.
you're having a good game, right? That's the important thing, right? Both players should be having fun. It's a social game.
Oh god, the charge move. So they give you these great diagrams here that show really obvious examples of how a charge should work, so we're almost directly aligned. But imagine, if you will, that this orc unit above was more like all the way over here. What do you do then? Well, it's the same thing. You need to do a full wheel until you're facing as close as possible before then moving towards them, and then contacting, and then you do the free wheel back into combat. And all of that has to be measured correctly.
Yep. And I think the biggest thing with the charge move to keep in mind, a big thing for new players, when you start your turn, before anyone's moved, what arc is my unit in relative to the thing I want to charge? And if I'm in the front arc, it doesn't matter how much more movement I have. It doesn't matter how many special rules I have. It doesn't matter if magic or abilities come in. If I am going to be able to declare a legal charge, whatever arc I started in, that is the only arc that I may make contact with my opponent. Irrelevant if I could get to a different arc. And this is, again, planning ahead and one of those things for new players to, because again, there are many rules. I'm not going to go into them now, in situations and scenarios with random movers and different things where it's actually pretty easy to get into different arcs. It doesn't matter. Even if your dragon can fly and has the movement to circle around that unit 6 times and then land, you still have to, whatever arc you're in with the start of your turn relative to the thing you're charging, that is the arc you're going into.
Right, and the way that you determine that is you have to figure out, from the target that you're charging's point of view, which arc are most of the charging unit's models in. So you look at these orcs, for example, POV, and if you take this 45-degree angle from the orcs, are all of these knights in the front, for example, or what is the majority? So in order for them to have to charge the flank of the orcs, they would have to have all of at least 3 of these bases be all the way over here to the side, if that makes sense. So it's not based on where the Chaos Knights are looking at, it's based on where the orcs are seeing, if that makes sense.
Yep. It's relative to their arc, not
well,
your arc.
And you can think about it, it's relative to the destination. Okay, so when you move or doing a charge, you can make a single wheel some point during your movement. Now, this is important because you can't do more than one wheel, except for that that closing the door that we talk about later. But so if you have like a obstacle in the way, you can't wheel once, go around it, and then wheel back around again, and then contact them. You can only really do that one time. So sometimes it's not possible to charge somebody because there's essentially like someone threw a boulder in the way, or a vortex, for example.
And that happens a lot. I got to be honest, for new players, you're just like, geez, I'm so close. My actual unit is actually only a few inches away from the enemy unit. And they're like, why can't I just charge? Because you can't. That's the point of this game, and a big part of the depth, why movement is so much more critical in the old world than even other games. Positioning, right? Putting your units, other units get in the way. Wheeling gets in the way, impassable objects get in the way, spells get in the way. You need to plan ahead and make sure you're positioning yourself, which is why, again, terrain is so critical in the old world, right? Slowing you down, getting in the way, it's a massive. I love to say terrain is the third player. So again, even if God, we're so close. Why can't we just break formation and run at each other? Because they don't break ranks. They're in this rank and file because that's the best way to survive the battlefield. That is the game you're playing. If they can't do it, you will totally get yourself in situations where you just can't make the charge, even though they are within the distance that seems like you should.
So you've finished your charge move in terms of the inches you have to measure in figure 3. This is where we are done with how far we had to go, and then this final pivot around is free. This is called closing the door in previous editions, and so they call it aligning to the enemy. But in other words, it's another wheel where the two units will wheel together and so that they're in contact. Now, what happens is the charging unit wheels first. If it gets stuck on something, for example, if there's like another unit or a boulder or I don't even know, and it can't get there, you then have to wheel in the enemy unit to contact if possible, and then if neither can get all the way in, it's a disordered charge. We'll talk about that later. But basically, we're going to do moving and wheeling for the charges. That's what's happening here. Oh, here's where we discuss the arcs. So as I was saying earlier, you have to look at the arcs based on the target unit. So based on these dwarves here, which arc are these orcs in? And so because 6 or so of the orcs are mostly in the right flank, they have to go to the flank arc, right? Mm-hmm. And these orcs are very obviously fully in the front. So these ones would go fully into the front arc. Now, if you're going to charge both of them, you would also then have to move in such a way so that this Unit C does not block Unit A from actually making it in there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there's an uncertainty, and usually whenever there's uncertainty in this, there's a lot of uncertainty in charges. You just try to figure out how can we resolve this. Can we just roll a die on a 1, 2, or 3? This happens. 4, 5, or 6. Something else happens. That, or you ask your tournament organizer to come over, and he's probably just going to tell you to do that.
Yep, it's totally reasonable. Yep, happens all the time. No problem.
So there's all kinds of unusual situations. We even started talking about them. So if you're unable to align, then the other person wheels to you, and if they can't either, it's a disordered charge. That means they don't get an initiative modifier for charging, and you actually don't count as in base to base. So if these Chaos Warriors if they were chosen or if they had Frenzy, they would only get 1 attack because they're just not in base to base. Mm-hmm. If you charge a fleeing enemy, then they have to flee as a reaction. They can't flee more than once, so then they can get run down. If you charge a unit that has a flee as a reaction, you can do a leadership test to try to redirect into a different unit. So one of the things that's kind of fun is you can try to like leadership bomb the enemy, lowering their leadership with like necromancy spells, for example, and then have a terror-causing like vampire dragon be like, I'm going to charge you, and then they have to take their terror check, they fail, they run away. You redirect into somebody else, take their terror check, they fail, they run away, and you're like, this is great, everyone's running away.
That's scary. Yeah, very scary out there on the battlefield.
Oh, also, when you redirect into another unit, they don't get to standard shoot, which is cool. So if you have a big shooting unit out there, there are sometimes some great ways to say, I have terror, I'm going to charge something else first. They're going to then probably, maybe, hopefully fail their terror check. I can then redirect into the shooting unit. They don't have time to shoot me now. It's great.
And something to keep in mind is you have to pass a leadership test in order to redirect. And you can only redirect once.
Yes, only redirect once.
That is possible that you still might not make it. You can't just keep doing it indefinitely. But it is great that they have it baked into the rules that you can redirect once. It definitely feels a lot better as the aggressor if the opponent flees or tears, that you can attempt to charge something else. So it feels really good that you can do that.
So multiple units can charge a single unit, and when this happens, you have to try to maximize both units equally. You can't, for example, favor these orcs over here and only have one goblin touching. You have to kind of straddle them as equally as possible within the movement values you get. Now, maybe if the orcs rolled really low, then they would have to only be like kind of corner to corner over here, and then the goblins might move in to take more models if they rolled higher, for example.
And this is a situation they're trying to deal with in the past, in previous editions, where people would say, "Hey, I'm going to have my big brick of really durable warriors charge your very deadly unit on the other side, and I'm going to have my big monster, and I'm going to have my big monster. I don't want to be counterattacked by you. I'm just going to have my big monster attack, tow one model of the edge of your unit and have my big defensive brick be in contact with their extra unit," because they were trying to min-max how many attacks the opposing player could get versus their more squishy or more vulnerable targets they cared about. That's a very nice, feel much better rule set that they have here. Addition that, no, you really need to equally maximize between both units, and as the person receiving the charge, it feels a lot better.
So in this case, if you ended up charging multiple units, then you have the same thing where Unit A will charge in, and because Unit A can't wheel to close the door on Units B and D, Units B and D have to close the door on it instead, which is why the other person now has to move so that they then touch you. Mm-hmm. Accidental contact. That's like a good... Anyway, it's like that's a pretty funny concept, but basically the idea is that occasionally you will accidentally bump into an enemy unit, and it depends. If you bump into the front of the enemy unit, they can choose whether they want to be in combat with the unit that does this, or back up 1 inch so that they stay out of combat with the unit that bumps into them. And if you bump into the side or rear of the enemy unit, they just move out of the way, always.
Hmm. It doesn't happen that often, but it will happen in just some weird circumstances, and it's great that they have rules to. Again, this is back towards what I said before. They did put a lot of effort into, hey, sometimes the rules are not going to play out perfectly because this is a very deep game with a lot of complex maneuvers and positioning. Things aren't always 100% going to work out. Here's a general guidelines and rules you should try to follow when these unusual situations happen. And I think it's great that they put a lot of effort into this. They're very helpful both as the players or when TOing an event to help players figure it out. I'm really glad that they include these guidelines because they didn't in previous editions. So I love that they made them.
So this is a pretty common situation, actually. If you have, let's say, a unit that's charging a unit of archers, and these archers are like, screw this, I'm going to flee. And so they run right through one of their own friendly units, and now the chargers can't get to them anymore because they're hiding behind somebody. And now, if they continue with their charge with the number they rolled, they'll hit this new unit. Well, now the charger gets to pick. Do I want to halt 1 inch away from the new unit that blocked our path? Or do we want to just continue ahead and get accidental contact into that unit and wheel to align them instead? And if you do,
Great
that unit then gets to have a reaction to this.
Mm-hmm. I love it.
But it does say that you're not allowed to do this unless if there's no way for you to have like wheeled to get past the unit that's in the way and then get catching the fleeing unit. And we are not done because there's also flee moves and direction of fleeing and all of this stuff. So when you flee center to center from an enemy unit. So if this unit A here is fleeing from unit B, we do a free pivot all the way around until we're facing away from them, and then we move from the imaginary center of those guys back to this direction, and you just kind of draw a line here. What I usually like to do is I like to try to measure from that center, and then I'll just put my unit in the facing once I figure out where the center is going to be. Other people will measure, for example, from the back of their bases to where the back will be after they move. It says here, obviously, so if you flee off the table or any board edge, you die. You're dead. And if you get caught, right, then you die.
Both bad.
Oh, and then if you flee through an enemy unit, every single model that flees through an enemy unit has to roll a die here, and on a 1, 2, or 3, they're just killed by the enemy unit they walked through. So this can happen. It's really funny if you have like a Great Eagle and you have a whole bunch of some powerful units that will flee through them, and then they all just start losing guys because they just walked through a Great Eagle. And you do have to pop through enemy units as well, so you can do some shenanigans like run some fast cavalry behind an enemy infantry unit and have them all strung out so that when the enemy infantry like does a fall back, and they'll pop through your cavalry, and they have to keep going. So they lose models to getting cut down, and they also have to keep popping through as far as it goes. And sometimes they just go off the table because they had the direction they had to move, and the enemy was in the way, so they just go off the table and they're dead.
So there's not a situation where you just are stuck on top of a friendly or an enemy unit. You will just having to keep move your unit until you are not on top of things. And typically it means you'll just pop through one unit. But again, if you're on the flank of an army and there's just a whole bunch of stuff lined up, this is one of the instances where we said the flee rules are pretty good typically about you're only moving the typical move distance once. This is the exception to the rule. If there are just things in the way, not terrain, but units, you're just going to keep going and going and going and going and going. And you can go some silly distances sometimes, but this is very important to avoid the situations where you get redirected in different areas, and it's a clean way to resolve it, even though it can have some unusual situations, but that doesn't happen that often.
Right. Now, another one that happens a lot, though, is that if you flee through your own friendly units, you cause them to take a panic test, unless if the unit that's doing this is a skirmisher and they're fleeing through a non-skirmisher, which is, again, that's just because there's all these special rules that interact and make this even more complicated later on. But basically, if you have a big brick of guys flee through another brick of guys, they have to see if they also want to run away too.
Yep.
Fleeing units have to take dangerous terrain tests if they run through it, and they also, if they have impassable terrain, they have to just try to automatically, they have to like wheel to go around terrain, which means if there's an impassable terrain right behind your unit that has to flee, it's really likely they get caught because they're like, okay, let's wheel, and then they have to like slowly walk around
You're
it, and
in
then
big trouble.
chasing them gets to just be like free pivot and just zigzag straight at you when you had to wheel, which is crazy.
Yep. Almost like fleeing into a giant wall or a boulder or something you can't move through is not a good strategy. Be careful about what your back is facing.
So you always flee away from the unit that has the highest unit strength. Now this
Mhm.
becomes a lot more obvious when you see it on the table. When you have like let's say a big brick of goblins and a wyvern, right, both fighting the same thing. You have to flee away from the bunch of the goblins, right? And this then can help
Mhm.
the other player, the orc player, to control where you're gonna go. So you can have
Yep.
that those kind of bodies bring in there. Sometimes units will sit there not even fighting because the guys are in a challenge, and you just have all these bodies there so that when they break and flee, they go the direction you want them to.
Mhm.
And then this is the rule that Mike was alluding to before that you can't flee more than once in a single phase of the game. So if you ever had to for some reason, you just sit there and flee 0 inches, and that's it. And then you just probably get killed.
If something contacts you, game over. The unit's gone.
Yeah. The only time I know that this might happen is if like you failed a panic check and you also got fleeing and then you got charged at the same time. I don't know, but whatever case, maybe you can't flee twice in the same phase.
Yep.
So that might seem like we covered everything, but we didn't because there's also two more move types that happen all the time, specifically in combat, but also from spells or shooting. And these are
Mhm.
give ground, which is where your unit will move 2 inches directly away from the unit that causes it. So, for example, if you have a give ground result in combat and you guys are kind of at diagonally to each other, you actually give ground diagonally away from wherever they were without changing your facing at all, and then they can diagonally follow up after you. Um,
Mhm.
or you fall back in good order, which is not actually at a different. It's center to center with the two units, and they will fall back from the biggest unit. And this counts as a flee move, which, if I'm not confusing you already, which means you can take the peril checks when you take a fallback in good order result. For example, I
Mhm.
think I had once. I was surrounded by a bunch of beastmen. My white lions had to do a flee move, and they bounced through like half of Greg's army just to get to the other side of the mountain. I think
Yeah.
Mike, you remember this?
I do, and some important things to keep in mind that a lot of people get some very important nuances wrong about these things, but are huge.
Yeah.
First is with the give ground. If you come into contact with terrain, or if you're already in terrain, you don't move.
Yes.
So that's a very important thing that most people forget. The other thing that almost tons of people forget all the time, I see them, is give ground is not a flee move.
Yeah.
I'm going to repeat that. Give ground is not a flee move, which means if you're near a table edge, you will not flee. You will not touch the table edge and kill your unit. It is only with a flee move that you actually touch the table edge. The unit continues fleeing and is wiped out. So that is another rule that people get wrong all the time.
So you also can't give ground into a friendly unit. So if you give ground and you touch a friendly unit, then you will just stop moving. So
Mm-hmm.
you can, for example, send in a bunch of skeletons who are unbreakable, so they can only give ground, and you can send in a bunch of zombies or something behind them, so that hey, if they lose, they can't give ground; they're stuck,
Mm-hmm.
and this will then force the enemy to stay there and to be locked in combat.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that probably throws a lot of people off is that give ground and fall back can be in two different directions. So depending on what you roll, you'll go in two different directions. Now the reason that this might happen is if you're fighting multiple units. When you're fighting multiple units, the give ground goes diagonally away from all of them. So if you have a unit in the
Mm-hmm.
front, unit in the flank, you're then if you have a unit to your north and a unit to your east, you will give ground southwest. So away
Mm-hmm.
from both. If you have a unit in your north and a unit in your east, and you fall back in good order, you flee directly away from the bigger one. So you're either going to go
Mm-hmm.
south or west, depending on which one of those two units was bigger, which means it's not the same direction.
Yeah, and the important thing is that if you're fleeing, again, keeping in mind or falling back in good order, which is a flee move, and you flee away from the biggest thing. If they're not in from the front rank, right? To Evan's example, one's in the north and one's in the east, right? The different flank. Depending on the order of operations of which unit you flee and which direction you go, it might make the other unit that what's trying to catch you closer than what it would have been. So it's getting flanked or reared or getting engaged on multiple frontages and fleeing from that is really bad. Almost like you don't want to have your unit flanked. Funny how that works.
Okay, so you're not allowed to move off the battlefield intentionally. No, you can overrun off the battlefield, which means you'll just come on later as if you're like a reinforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And then reinforcements or ambushers, for example, they come on during the compulsory move subphase, which means then they can't charge, but they can move afterwards.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think. Nope.
No, move. This is the longest phase. I think we're almost there, Evan. Almost there. Woo.
So there's terrain, right? And you have open ground, which is just you get to move normally. Difficult ground lowers your movement characteristic by 1, unless if you have moved through cover. And it also makes your charges horrible. We'll talk about that later.
Mm-hmm.
But and so if a unit is within 25% or more of the models are in difficult ground, you are disrupted, which means you lose your rank bonus. Now this is something people forget all the time. If you have a big brick of goblins, and even 25% of them, which is not that many, is in the woods, they don't get their rank bonus, they don't get their leadership bonus, and they are screwed.
Mm. Now, what do you mean they don't get their leadership bonus?
Because they have warband.
Just that they don't get their rank. There we go. So,
yeah.
goblins in this example, a lot of those horde units will have the warband special rule, which means their rank bonus will be added to their leadership bonus, which is key to that unit being a pivotal, stable, durable unit that will remain in position. So for those horde units with warband, this is double bad because you're not only losing that rank bonus for combat, your leadership bonus that you would have got goes down. And typically warband units have a lower starting leadership because they're relying on the additional ranks. So again, terrain is a big deal in the old world.
So there's also dangerous terrain, which is where if any of the moves that we talked about, charge move, flee move, pursuit, regular marching, whatever, even if you do a reform, any movement while you're within dangerous terrain, all of the models that moved through it have to take a dangerous terrain test, which is where on a 2+ they're totally fine, but on a 1 they lose a wound. Now, if you have like a unit of 40 goblins walking through dangerous terrain, that means like 7 of them are just gonna die, which is a lot.
An important note in the FAQ is that this dangerous terrain test, you do not get your ward saves, you do not get your regen saves, you do not get your armor save. You suffer that wound, and there's nothing you can do to prevent it. Almost like it's dangerous.
Well, there is one thing you can do. You can have move through cover, which lets you re-roll the 1s into potentially another 1. I've had that happen. Or you can have Illithamar barding or armor that many of the high elf units have, which let them re-roll it as well, even though they don't have move through cover.
But those are, again, special rules that give you a bonus. But this is something that people get very confused of. Oh, I suffer a wound. I could take my armor. It's like, or I could take my regen, or I could take my ward. They specifically FAQ'd it. Nope. You roll this 1. You're suffering the wound. You don't get any saves. Ouch.
Yeah, it's a sprained ankle, and you have to walk home. Okay. Anyway, so we have impassable, which means things you just can't move through at all. So you have to just go around it. And this includes fleeing units, so they have to just go around it.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
The woods are essentially, this is fun, they say they're either difficult or dangerous. And by the way, this section is talking about terrain and movement. There's another section later that talks about terrain again that also talks about this. So that can obviously just come up later. But I think that the main thing here is that there's also ones for if you have decorations. So any piece of terrain that's less than 2 inches across is it's just pretty. You can just move through it. Just ignore.
But back to the woods, I think the important thing there is, again, just make sure if you're going to an event, ask your TO, figure out what the table you're playing on, or if there's not, check with your opponent, hey, the woods here, are we treating these as difficult or dangerous? And just to be clear, if something is dangerous terrain, it is also difficult terrain.
Right.
Unless specifically a TO or somebody said this is dangerous and not difficult, and they made a custom rule. But by default, if it is dangerous, it is also difficult.
Okay, well, we're done now.
We did it. We made it through movement. Woo! I think that might be the longest beginner intro tutorial video that exists in the book. We'll find out. Maybe I'm wrong. Well, special rules might be longer, but we're not going to cover that today. But we did get to the end of movement. We made our way through. Hopefully you found that helpful and educational. And again, please do, as always, like, share, subscribe if you got to the end of this. Evan, any closing words, sir?
The same as always. Stay legendary.
All right. We'll see you next time. Bye.